if questions come up along the way too, I'll pull those in. But all righty, ladies and gentlemen, good to see all of you out there in the interwebs. We're live again here with This Week in Drones, coming to you most time Thursdays at 1 p.m. Today we moved it to a good old Friday, and we wanted to get this in ahead of Exponential next week. The four of us here will be there, and a whole lot of folks that we know from the industry. A lot of our friends will be there, so we're excited to connect and to talk shop about, all things drones and counter drone and, ground-based detect and avoid and, flying drones beyond visual line of sight for all sorts of applications. So we'll be hitting that next week together at this expo. But today, and the reason I wanted to have this before the expo next week is that Scott Parker, our good friend here, good friend of the pod, actually has a lot of information on 2209, this NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, that just hit the streets. And I know my phone has been blowing up with people saying, hey, how does this affect us? We're in the water sector, we're in the utilities, we're in all these different industries. Like, what's your opinion of this? What do you think? And so when Scott gave me the heads up that he has a lot to share, a lot of wisdom and insight and thoughts just to walk critical infrastructure owners and operators through, what is this rule? What does it mean for you? How do you apply for it? How do we prepare before it comes out? And in fact, he's going to be speaking next week at Expo on some of these topics. So I was like, man, it would be awesome for all of us out here in this community to have the chance to start and spark this conversation. And then tag up with any of the folks here. And you guys, let's pick this conversation up next week in person, and don't miss Scott's presentation there at Expo on this. So with that said, we'll do a quick round of introductions, and I'll just do myself, Michelle, Max, and then Scott. I'll let you do an intro, and then right off your intro, just you can take us right into the the sub parts of this NPRM. We'll dive in. And guys, as we're live here, feel free to send in your questions. Drop comments and ask questions on LinkedIn or YouTube, and I'll try to pull them up so that Scott, Michelle, Max, myself can speak to them while we're live. So with that said, yours truly, David Lewin. Also, obviously with This Week in Drones and day job over at Echodyne, helping with radars, right, for ground-based detect and avoid. And so I'll be bringing up more of that, like concrete, like sensor, what sensors do we use, that whole kind of perspective to the conversation today. So Michelle, I'll toss it to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming back to us. My name is Michelle Duquette, CEO of 3MAD Air. And my position today is as everyone is probably sick of hearing, interoperability and ensuring that whatever we're doing is scalable and plays well with others. So what that means it's beyond technology. It's more in this circumstance, it's more around the policies and how the policies play well with each other as we move down the food chain to boots on the ground, immediate event, and the kinds of situations that 2209, I think, is the next step forward in getting us there. So I'm really happy to have this conversation, David. Thank you.
Awesome. Max.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Max Rosen, Director of Government Affairs for Echodyne. I manage all of our government, congressional, regulatory affairs work with the executive branch and Congress at the federal level, and then do a lot of work with state, local, tribal, territorial folks as well to support David and the rest of our colleagues over here at Echodyne. I'm very excited that the 2209 NPRM is out after 10 years. I was just telling David that I was actually working on Capitol Hill in 2016 when that NPRM was mandated. So I've been tracking this one for a long, long time. So lots to talk about today, and look forward to seeing many of you next week. Kick it over to Scott.
Thanks, Max. I appreciate it. And thanks, David, for the opportunity to be here. So Scott Parker, currently the founder of Air Risk Solutions, focused on helping critical infrastructure and public safety agencies understand and manage the risk posed by drones, both cyber and physical risk. Prior to founding Air Risk, I was the chief for U.S. security at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where I had the opportunity to focus on everything from the cybersecurity concerns of foreign-made drones and as well as how do we manage the risk around critical infrastructure as well as public gatherings. So, this rule coming out is really exciting, not only from what Max just spoke about with a 10-year timetable to it, but there was a lot of work that went into it early on to try to figure out how to do this properly where you still protected infrastructure while also respecting the airspace. So I look forward to having this conversation and sharing what I've already digested with the NPRM that's been released, and hopefully for an engaging conversation with anyone who's listening. So Dave, if you want to, I can go right into it, or
yeah, I figure, Scott, you were kind of explaining to me backstage that there's going to be a process for critical infrastructure owners and operators that they're going to need to follow in order to get airspace restrictions over their sites, right, or their critical facilities. So if you could walk us through a little bit about what that process is going to look like. You mentioned that there's some things that folks can be doing now before the actual rule is established to position themselves to be thinking, correctly to kind of align with what's coming out. And then, just in general, what are the subparts, the components that go into this regulation, and, what do we need to be thinking about in those terms? And of course, Michelle, Max, feel free to jump in and tag off of where Scott's going as well. Ask questions or bring wisdom, because I think folks out there are, it's fresh. They're really wanting as much information as they can get. But yeah, back to you, Scott.
Thanks, David. So as we've talked about, there's a notice of proposed rulemaking that just released this week, and we have 60 days. It's a good thing the FAA gave a nice long window. We have to 6 July to get comments back on the Section 2209 rulemaking, which is essentially, if you're not tracking just a very high level cliff note of it, it's FAA's mandate to have a application process for critical infrastructure to petition them for enduring flight restrictions. It's kind of the sum. And so this rule is what's going to try to make that happen. As written, it contains, and I think if you go through the 180 pages of the notice of proposed rulemaking, you'll note that there are basically 8 subparts that are the meat of the rule, which kind of gives you the applications process, the approval process, and the maintenance and the renewal process. So I think it's good to kind of go through those 8 at a high level during this conversation, and then talk about what I think the critical infrastructure community should be doing in order to prepare for that for when the rule is released. So like I said, there's 8 general subparts. The first one is just that. It's a general overview of the Section 2209 process. Interestingly, what it does is not only create something called a UAFR, a UAS flight restriction, but it breaks it down into 2 distinct types of UAFRs. There is a standard UAFR and there is a special UAFR. The standard UAFR, I think, is going to be the predominant type of restriction that the FAA is going to be considering, because that one it includes all 16 of the critical infrastructure sectors. It goes through the process of defining those terms for those, and to kind of get into the little bit in the weeds on the 2. The standard, it allows for a lot of different flexibility in overflight, and it allows for more of an integration into the airspace methodology for critical infrastructure. The special was more of a, in my opinion, like the FAA pivot away from 99.7 SSIs, those are special security instructions that the FAA has used as a national security type TFR. You think of the NFL Super Bowl or Boston Marathon or military areas. For a long time, the FAA has used those 99.7s kind of a placeholder for those. So this 2209 gives them that real opportunity to think about how do they pivot away from 99.7s and create a more formal process that allows for some type of public notice, and kind of more aligned with what the FAA typically does with protected airspace and restricting airspace. So I think that first part, it really sets the stage in part 1, or part A as they call it. It sets the stage for understanding what the rules are in general, and it sets the conditions for who can apply. those 16 sectors, and we'll get more into later on what those sector requirements look like. Sector or subset B, that's where you really get.
Before you move on, just to clarify for listeners out there, could you rattle off the 16 sectors by chance? And I'm curious. Well, I'm really curious if state prisons was actually added to the previous list. I thought I'd heard that they'd done some work and maybe gotten added as the option, to be able to add flight restrictions under 2209 when the new rule comes out. So that was mainly why I asked that, but I'm just curious for folks listening, could this apply to them, or are they out of the picture already?
It does. So there are 16 sectors, like I said, and I would encourage you to go to CISA's website, and there are subsectors to those 16 sectors as well to really understand the breadth of the critical infrastructure community. But state prisons would fall under the government services sector. And so your public, your first responders, those type of facilities, government services sector, which is those federal facilities and state facilities that you would protect under this 2209. So it calls them out specifically and gives them an avenue. I do think it probably will be a standard style TFR. Unlikely they would have a special TFR, the federal more 997s, but they still have a process. But in addition to things like government services sector, you have sectors like the chemical sector, the nuclear sector, the energy sector, the transportation sector, the finance sector, the agriculture sector, the emergency services sector, communications sector, IT, information technology sector, the dams sector, critical manufacturing sector. I don't know, I wasn't counting them, but I'm sure I probably missed a few, but it really covers water, wastewater sector, absolutely. And so the important thing here, and I think it's worth taking a minute to say, the way Congress wrote the initial FESA 2209 rule is they highlighted the statutory definition of critical infrastructure, but then took the time to highlight and call out 6 discrete types of critical infrastructure. They called oil and gas out, which is energy. They called out energy. They called out nuclear. They called out amusement parks, which is part of the commercial facilities sector. And they called out chemical. So I think early on, a lot of people were thinking that was what the congressional intent was, is to protect those subsets of critical infrastructure. And I would say that the FAA was on the azimuth to do that as the iterative first step. The administration, when they took over in January, though, they had a very different perspective, and they pivoted away from those narrow definitions that were called out as examples in the 2209, and they expanded it to all 16 sectors, which is part of the delay. Even today, as fast as they got it out with the start of the administration, that caused somewhat of a delay because it was a major pivot away from 6 discrete sectors into the 16 that we have now in the proposed rule. So for me, that's exciting, right? Because it opens up the opportunity for unknown risk and threats to materialize, and without having to go back to a rulemaking or to Congress for additional authorities.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. And I think the next one is subpart B. This is where you really, really have to spend time in thinking about the burden of the applications process on the actual owner and operator of the critical infrastructure, because it sets aside certain minimum requirements that they're going to have to really take account for. And they make a lot of sense. And I think FAA did a good job of spotlighting the things that are necessary and giving enough flexibility in the language, and a little bit of other areas where it's less specified and it's more malleable in how the critical infrastructure community can pursue an application. But basically what it talks about is in infrastructure, it sets boundaries. And so they have taken the time of saying infrastructure will have to have defined boundaries around their fence line, basically. In the past, we've had this ability to have a center point and draw a 1 mile, 3 mile radius around something and call that restricted airspace, like with the 997. They're taking a different approach here where you have to have defined boundaries around your facility, and you really can't go beyond your fence line, so to speak. And that, it causes some, these are the tripwires, and where, people making their voice heard is going to be important, especially in the critical infrastructure community. it really limits your ability to have advance notice or have a delayed approach where you can, affect flights outside your facility. So that both vertical and horizontal boundary is something, or lateral boundaries are important to know. They do go 400 feet as far as the vertical aspect, or 400 feet above your tallest asset. Other requirements that I think are important to recognize in subpart B is they require the organization to have pretty well established security posture. So you're likely not going to get a UAFR if you don't have an established fence line with established security protocols already in place to prevent terrestrial threats. And that kind of tracks and makes sense, right? It doesn't make sense to protect the airspace if you're not going to protect the ground space. So that is one thing they're pretty explicit about, and also having a security plan in place that formally addresses drone threats. And I think that's going to be some of the hurdle for critical infrastructure, make sure they do that right. And some of the things like finding the right ways in which you can have obscuring certain risk, or finding ways you can harden certain areas as a requirement from the FAA. It's going to be something they're going to have to navigate. But basically, you're going to find a way from the applicant's process of expressing to the FAA that you have done everything you can to deal with the risk to your organization. And the next step is to restrict airspace. So the burden is going to be on the organization, not only to make clear that they have a problem, and there's consequence of a potential risk and threat from a drone, but they're going to have to go beyond that a little bit. And this is where some of the partners may be thinking and scratching their head. They're going to have to provide a case that describes what a flight restriction does to both the economy of drone flights. So if you start forcing drones to fly around a facility, what does that do to the efficiency of the NAS? So that's one thing that they're going to have to navigate in their applications process. And the other is, what is the environmental impact? If they start to shift drones away from a chemical plant and over a wooded area, and there's some protected species in that area, you're going to have to do some type of environmental impact study to really make sense of the purpose of this flight restriction and start weighing the cost and benefit of that. So when you start to put that into context, that's a lot of things for an infrastructure organization to really contemplate and consider. And the last one, I think, in the minimum requirements, and the FAA is a little bit squishy with this, is this idea that they're going to need to demonstrate at least 24 months of activity around their facility. I think you probably know better than a lot of people. The critical infrastructure community has been a little bit slow to invest in detection technology because of the return on investment. They can't do anything about it when they do see it, which is a common conversation I have. So they needed a way to make a business case for detection technology. So you're going to have a lot of organizations that simply don't have the data to demonstrate that there is a pattern of life around their facilities that would require some type of flight restriction. Again, they're kind of squishy because it said if available in the rule. And I think you'll get a lot of comments from organizations that says that it's not available, and how does that affect my application? Because I can't look back. I can't discover 24 months of activity if I've never done it. So that minimum requirements piece is really what I'm calling the burden part of the applications process that you're shifting to the private sector in order to establish a flight restriction. The next one is really where you're also going to get a lot of input, and this is subpart C, which is the sector-specific criteria. This is
Scott, you want to hang tight with B just for a second, because I think for each of us here, I'd love to hear kind of dive into this a little bit. For one, you mentioned the 24 months of data. I mean, that's pretty interesting. But actually, first, I don't know, Michelle, I'm curious what your opinion is, or if you want to dive in at all. I'm curious about the impact to the flow of traffic. Was it like the impact of the national airspace or NAS, or I don't know how that was worded, Scott, but I'm kind of curious to, maybe you could just mention again what that is for my clarification. And then if Michelle, if you have any like insights or thoughts, I think people out there would really be interested in noting, like, what does that mean? Like, in other words, if I just put up a flight restriction today over 100 of my sites, if I'm a critical infrastructure owner, then all of a sudden you can't just fly, delivery drones and whatever else is going on. You have to now route around me or over, or however that works. Like, what does that mean? And then it sounds like it's on the owner or operator to already provide some sort of a study around that. Like, I'm so curious.
That's it. I'm going to help with Michelle, but basically that's it. There's an expectation that the owner and operator or the applicant is going to have some awareness of what the restriction is going to do to the efficiency of airspace, right? And I'll get later into like some part G later on is there are allowable flights over these restricted airspaces, kind of like a LANCE process that is the FAA is built in. But all the hobbyists and others who may not qualify, what does that do to them? And what does it do to someone who doesn't want to go through the process of getting a waiver from the FAA? So I think it's kind of become a cost to the ecosystem of drones and taking that to account. But Michelle, I would love your perspective on that.
Sure. I have to say that I feel like this is a step in the right direction. This is how we help define predictability for the lower altitude operating environment. So being able to have static UAFRs that have a specifically published life cycle is what gives those folks who are in that operating vicinity the predictability that they need in order to plan their operations accordingly. Where if it's a TFR, then, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. That's a temporary flight restriction. So I really like that the FAA has taken this position. I appreciate that as an operator, it would give me confidence in how I plan my routes, because I know that there's a known entity, a known restriction that I can depend on. What worries me is this is going to be yet one more thing for a UAS service supplier to have to bake in to how whatever their services are. And there's a notification, expectation here for the standard UAFR and for the special as well. And we've just gone through reimagining what the legacy NOTAM system looks like. It's now more automated, and this isn't in there. So we still have these disconnects. If we want this to truly be a one NAS, they're working on the brand new ATC system, BNATs. Now, wouldn't it have been wonderful to have been able to have the low altitude operating environment, just the basic structure as part of the consideration? Even though it's just a tech refresh for phase one, there is tech that is evolving in the low altitude environment that has some influence on where they put those new radars and what kind of radars they put there. And I still am feeling a gap between, legacy aviation NAS and the low altitude operating environment. But that said, I'm very much in favor of this NPRM, how it was approached. I think it's thoughtful. I like it. It depends on remote identification. Of course, there's the other side of that, and there's the technology that they use to receive that. I guess it data in, data out. It's only as good as what you put in. If we're not making sure that it's being processed appropriately and applied appropriately, there could be some problems there. So there's this other end issue that I think also needs to be addressed. But I think all those things can be worked out. So I guess my position is so far so good. I'm happy with it.
Beautiful. I love that. And yeah. Oh, Max, please. But I was just going to say, it's cool for me to learn as well where each of our expertise comes into play and how, rule makings like this can help pull the entire team together and make sense of each of the roles, and not just make sense to me, but make sense to a critical infrastructure owner or operator who is like maybe skittish about putting up sensors to detect drones, but now they say, well, man, we need to start getting our data now so we can prepare. Of course, that's my part, but then, maybe they can bring in Michelle and 3 Mad Air early on to start addressing how would rerouting drones around our facility impact the NAS, and how do we communicate so that we tie into all these cool new ATC monitors. All about that. We don't. We know electricity or water or something, and Scott, with what you do, with regarding like consulting for these folks around their security platform and, everything there to make sure they have a really robust program so they can present, hey, we want a restriction because here's our whole plan that goes into how we detect, how we track, how we respond when there is an event. And it's cool to see, that this kind of blends it all together and makes sense of each of our parts. But just a comment from me. Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a little commentary on just sort of what this means more broadly, right? I think Scott and Michelle are really well situated to sort of dig into the specifics and all the technical pieces and what has to be displayed and submitted to the FAA in order to be granted one of these flight restrictions. And I was mentioning this to my colleagues here before the podcast started. This is just another example of increased focus on these issues that we've seen over the last year that I think is unlike any other focus that we've seen and unlike any other progress that we've seen in this industry, pretty much in the industry's entire existence. Since last summer and even predating that, sort of the drone sightings over New Jersey, put that in quotation marks for a reason, but last summer, the drone executive orders came out, right, which were these pretty big, pretty landmark executive orders from the Trump administration related to drones and counter drones and ensuring drone dominance and restoring airspace sovereignty. And we've sort of seen a series of events that have happened since those executive orders. Some of them were outlined in the executive order, but some of them I think just sort of rode on those executive orders momentum. And we've seen so many different things happening in this space between congressional hearings and congressional testimony on drone issues and counter drone issues and the threat and PRC drones and what we've seen overseas and all these different things from an oversight standpoint in Congress. But then we've seen this drone dominance moniker kind of continue in the Trump administration, where we saw the drone dominance initiative rolled out by the Department of War, lots of money going into direct purchases from drone manufacturers. We recently had an FCC notice that also was, a drone dominance focused request for information that recently closed not too long ago that we at Echodyne submitted comments on, and I know countless others in the industry did as well. On the commercial side, we're seeing the 2209 NPRM come out after 10 very long years. The Part 108 rule, hopefully being finalized by, later this year, early next year. There's just a lot of momentum, right? And this is all happening while in the background, the folks at DHS and all over the country are preparing 24 hours a day for the World Cup coming up this summer. And it's really great to see all this progress. It's really great to see so many different folks commenting on these RFIs and these requests for information when they come out from the folks in the executive branch. And I think it all kind of goes back to this theme that I've been bringing up on a lot of these podcasts, is that the more you make your voice heard, the more things actually get done. And I think that all of this positive momentum rolling into Exponential next week in Detroit, the timing really couldn't be better. And that show is shaping up to be a really big show with a ton of different types of stakeholders, a ton of different government officials, and it couldn't have been better times to be right on the heels of this 2209 NPRM coming out and just everything else that I mentioned here on the podcast that has been happening over the last year in this space. So I know I'm personally really excited to see everybody in Detroit next week. I think there's going to be a different vibe and a different aura to the show this year compared to years past, just because of all of that progress that we've been seeing. And I'm really excited to hear from my colleagues in the industry, from folks in the government, about what additional things are to come based off of all of this positive momentum that we've seen. So I encourage everybody next week to, again, shake as many hands and see as many people as possible, because I really think that this is one of the most consequential trade shows for the commercial drone industry to date, just based on the timing of when it's happening and all of these other things that are happening in the background.
So let me just foot stomp that. What I'm hearing through the, out here in the wild, through the grapevines, is that we are returning to pre-COVID government attendance numbers. So folks, I can't tell you how significant that is. We've gone through COVID, we've gone through government shutdowns, we've gone through budget cuts, and we're now getting back at the point where the energy, the acceptance, the approvals are all starting to come together. So if you are the one or two people listening to this who are not planning on going to exponential, number one, I suggest you can reconsider. But number two, try and connect with somebody that you know is going, because anything that you want to be able to clarify, they'll be able to find somebody to help you with that. So, and make those connections for you.
Absolutely. Great. All right. Awesome. Well, back to you, Scott. Let's move on to, I think you said the section C or subpart C.
Subpart C. Absolutely. And before I jump too far into that, I mean, Michelle, she talked about it, and I think I may have overlooked it in the subpart B, but this need, and I think it's going to be a friction point. You're going to get a lot of comments, the FAA will. This requirement for remote ID sensors is something that we've got to figure out what that really means. I think the rules, they're going to be partners who are going to try to reach out and clarify what that means. But it's the first requirement that is being levied upon critical infrastructure to say you have to be able to establish and maintain airspace awareness. And they're taking it to what you have to see is the remote ID. What's being broadcast, and so it's going to be upon them to figure out what sensors that is and how they're going to operationalize that. But it's going to be a new space for many of them, which I think is going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Now, is that going to be a hard requirement no matter what, or is it a requirement if you want to apply for a flight restriction?
It all applies to UAFR, right? So if you're going to have a flight restriction, you're going to need to have some way in which you can, I'm calling it a way to operationalize a flight restriction, right? So you're going to be getting waivers all the time. You're going to have your own flights. You're going to have to figure out a way, and we've talked about this forever, of threat discrimination. And there's no real way to do that without some type of way in which you can determine who's flying above your facility, and that's through some type of detection or sensor. I'm sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
So think about it this way. If you are a facility and you're serious about needing to restrict unauthorized drone operations around your facility, it's likely you already have some type of detection, some type of remote ID and radar, so that you're getting cooperative and non-cooperative together. If you don't, this is a wake-up call that this is the right approach that the FAA accepts to identifying that volume of airspace, that UAFR, that they recognize as a way to put those boundaries in place for low altitude ops. So I don't think it's going to be, this rule will not require blanketing the world with remote ID, but it will make it very clear that remote ID is an acceptable level of identification for cooperative aircraft. And if you have not taken that step already, then you either don't really need a UAFR, or you're now educated. You need to go get that in order to qualify for a UAFR.
Yeah, absolutely. A quick analogy I used in a conversation earlier that helps some, the physical security minded kind of understand the reason why detection technology may be of benefit is you go through the process of establishing a fence line and a boundary, and then typically you put some type of CCTV or other type of sensor on it to determine if someone's trying to cross that boundary, so you can, because you have established a no trespass expectation, or you have some type of entry control where you have to present some type of a badge or something to get through. So you've established the foundation of a no trespass, but you need some way to make sure that you maintain it. It's the same thing. The restriction is a no trespass sign in the air, and that's only as good as your ability to enforce it. And enforcement is really relying upon some type of detection technology to know when someone is violating that or encroaching on that no restriction rather. So I know we're moving into it. I'm just moving into number 3 of 8 subparts. So I try to be a little bit quicker, David. And the next one is important to really kind of unpack. So when the FAA looked at the magnitude of critical infrastructure, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of facilities across the country that would qualify for one of the 16 sectors, and that's quite frankly too many. And although they're all critical infrastructure, not all critical infrastructure is nationally critical or nationally sensitive infrastructure. So they needed a way in which they could gate that down to what's most important and what is most deserving of the infrastructure that has a need. So they created this criteria across the 16 sectors, and they worked hand in glove in many ways with the sector risk management agencies that are responsible for informing those 16 sectors, and created that criteria. And some of it, I think is going to be it would be friction points for some sectors. Example, if you are an oil producer, you need to be producing 100,000 barrels of oil a day. So that's a criteria. If you're not doing that much oil, then you won't qualify to walk in the door of the applications process. Natural gas liquid natural gas has their own qualifications. Energy production has their own qualifications on the amount of energy to produce. 500 kilowatts for a substation, for example. If you're doing 400, you just simply won't qualify, and you won't get your foot in the door of the applications process. So they did that, and if you read the rule, you'll see that, and I know this for a fact, they did it to try to keep it to the most important, but also not overburden the process in the beginning, because this is going to mature over time, right? And so if you look at it as it is, I think the rough order of magnitude is about 9,000 or between 9 and 10,000 facilities across the country that would probably qualify based on the criteria they've created. And that's going to kind of go up and down maybe as comments come in. And they did not do comments for water, wastewater. They did not build criteria for water, wastewater, and agriculture. So that's going to change it a little bit as well. But roughly about 10,000, I think, is a sweet spot for what they were hoping for. So if you go in and you look at it, you'll see that criteria is all there. And that's where a lot of the back and forth, I think, will come. Moving forward is really kind of...
Sorry to interrupt, Scott, but some of the folks that have been asking me about this are actually in the water sector. And if they're tuning in, I just wanted you to be able to speak to that comment of, maybe perhaps why there was no threshold created for them. Does that just mean because they want them to be able to protect every single site without limit, or is there something they should be considering commenting over the next 60 days to help the FAA know how, or be able to refine it, or how can they be involved with that?
Well, it's hard to say exactly. I mean, if you think about going back to the SRMAs are the ones that provided most of the input to the FAA to have to understand what the risk is to the sector. When you look at the SRMA for the water and wastewater community, that's the EPA. And so you could probably think about why that was a challenge for them when it comes to establishing standards for what is critical, nationally sensitive water and wastewater. And I think it's really good that the FAA did this. It's kind of a recognition that we need more input from the community. Going out to those in the industry and saying, hey, what is it that you're thinking is actually nationally sensitive? Is it population based? Is it water that supports a particular entity? You know, is it supporting a military base? Is it supporting, you know, a data center? What is this water doing that is nationally sensitive or critical? So I think it's just a recognition they didn't have the right expertise in the room at the time to make a really informed decision, but also being honest about that and saying, hey, we need help from the private sector in making this clear to us. So for water, wastewater, and agriculture, it's really a good opportunity to really establish the criteria and make your voices heard. So of all of them, probably they have the biggest opportunity where they don't already have predefined criteria that they're going to have to be working against. And so they can maybe shape it for themselves. Understand there's going to be scrutiny to what they provide, right? They're still going to scope it right. So I think that's the reasons why. It's probably not the best answer, but you know, it's kind of hard to understand fully.
Can you provide expertise on that if they reach out to you?
Absolutely, yeah. You know, whenever we talked a little bit about New Jersey, New York, 2023 issue of all the drone sightings. What I had the opportunity to do is work with New York and New Jersey to determine which of those critical infrastructure sectors and facilities we protected with that 30-day TFR. If you remember back, we did establish 99.7s over about 250 or so facilities, and some of those were water and wastewater, and that was done deliberately. So we have some of that, but I think understanding the risk to water and wastewater that drones pose is something I can definitely participate in and help with, and I already plan to do it with some members already and partners. And so it's all about making a case and making the national security nexus to it. And some of those are not that hard to do.
Cool.
Yeah. So moving quickly to the next part, which is kind of the decision point, part D and E. There's an FAA evaluation where all this information goes into a process. And I think they're going to have to make clear what the process looks like still. But they're going to make a determination. Both did you meet the general criteria? Are you a fixed site critical infrastructure per statute, and did you meet the minimum requirements that I talked about, the lateral boundaries and all the other stuff, and security plan and detection technology, and then did you meet that gating criteria? So they go through and they're going to evaluate you based off those terms, kind of in a somewhat of a rigid way. It's like you check box or you don't, and then they're going to work with the SRMAs to figure out the reality of the risks explained by the facility. And so the SRMAs will be able to say, yes, we agree with this assessment that that particular facility with these particular parameters meets a national significance concern and we should proceed with a flight restriction. So there's going to be a back and forth between those two. And either they're going to approve it or they're going to deny it. And if they deny it, they've already built in the next subpart E, a reconsideration process where you have a certain amount of days, and it's not very long. I think it's 30 days. I have to go back and check, but there's a certain amount of days in which you can appeal, and the appeal, the way it's looking is not really appealing their determination. Is if something that they are determining is erroneous, so it's not right, and the appeal can directly speak to, hey, you got that wrong. We're not 400 kilovolts as a substation. We're 550. Please look at it. So, you know, but you do have the process to appeal, and it doesn't mean you can't reapply later on in the future. You still can, but they made those very clear of you approve it, great. And there's a process for approval. Another thing that's in that space between the approval and denial also, and the SRMA coordination, is public notice. And I think this is a big deal for the FAA because it's what they've always wanted to be doing. Is there's going to be a 30-day public notice that once they got it and they agree with it, that it meets the conditions and standards, they're going to put it out for public notice for 30 days and they'll get comments on those things. And that's where you're going to really get everyone coming in to make their voices heard on what the disruption to the airspace really is. And after that 30 days, they'll make a determination on whether or not they approve it, or they deny it, like I said.
Wow, that really enlightens or brings up this concern that I've been getting from friends on this, which is there a risk in exposing the most critical facilities by placing these UAFRs, and what you just described would even further announce, I don't know what all would be included in that notice in terms of specifics, but you certainly would know the lat long, the specific location of a critical facility in that notice itself, right? And so, what's your take on that in general?
It's a concern. I can't say it's big or small. It's a concern from the critical infrastructure community. Although the FAA do make allowances in the general portion of the subparts of how they will protect, you can submit, sensitive information, and they're going to protect it. You can submit classified information, and they're going to protect it. They're going to have to make clear, though, at the FAA's position, is something I think will be commented on, is how they're going to protect that information from FOIA, how they're going to protect that information from a number of releases, so we're not giving out more information that's necessary, especially when it comes to how they are maintaining security of these facilities. So their security plans will be something that's part of the applications process. You don't want their security plan to be in some way leaked. I'm not saying the FAA would do that. I'm sure they're going to have a very nuanced way in which they talk about simply the flight restriction and the boundaries maybe, and the impact to the NAS. I doubt they're going to get into the weeds on whether or not the public believes that it's justified. And so there wouldn't be a need to talk about the security and the consequence. I would hope not. But it still brings up a very important concern that they in the security and the cybersecurity space have, is how much information are you going to make public in this process outside of the boundaries, which in and of itself can be of a concern, right? Just a label. But that may be one of those necessary evils that you have to, take on. You can't have restrictions to the public's airspace without it being known to the public. So,
So I think that's the bottom line, right? We are in an unclassified national airspace system, and therefore all of the information is public. However, we do have mechanisms in place where we do protect, I'll put that in air quotes, protect sensitive areas. There's also a reality that we don't own all the satellites. So, yeah, maybe this is another way, but it's not the only way to find out where these critical infrastructure locations are. There are plenty of ways to find out where they are, and they use them today. I think that there was probably a thorough balancing of pros and cons here, and really the situational awareness that this is bringing to the low altitude operating environment and to just legacy aviation in general is sorely needed. So I get the sensitivity. Well, why don't we just, announce it that, here's a hotspot. Go ahead, take aim. We don't have to say that for the bad guys to already know where these places are. So let's talk to the good guys and help them avoid these areas so that it makes it easier for those people protecting those areas to determine who's who in the zoo.
Yeah, threat discrimination is the key for that part. Yep.
Yeah, and it's just like the cybersecurity world where, they have a very robust process of the white hat good guys exposing vulnerabilities for themselves, so to speak. But then the world hears about it so that everyone can go and fix those vulnerabilities. And you do give it to the bad guys at the same time as the good guys, but it's kind of that necessary evil, as you mentioned, Scott, in this process. And I suppose if it's a top secret facility that is top secret, and you never want someone to know it's on the map, then don't put it on the map, I guess. But if it's a concern like, hey guys, this is sitting right on this hill and this is this vulnerable, and some guy's flying over it with his drone, well, that guy obviously knows where it is already anyway. At that point, it's like, it kind of does make sense to just say, well, we're going to put a no trespassing sign on this by putting requesting UAFR so we can prosecute if somebody crosses that line. And then, of course, you had to give them notice that there's a line there, to your point, or how will you prosecute them for crossing a line that they didn't ever get notice of? So
for sure. And I think, there's probably less concern on for the most part, on the partners, the communities labeling themselves as restricted airspace. There's just an underlying concern of you're submitting a lot of your very important, critical, sensitive data on how you protect your assets and how you protect your your intellectual property and all those things, and you're giving it to the federal government to use in a process to restrict airspace. So you don't want to give all that up without knowing that it's going to be proper procedures in place to protect it. And I think we can do that. I have no problems with the PCII program and other programs that are in place to protect it. It's just that, you're asking for a lot of information about how we protect critical infrastructure, and you have to protect it properly. And I don't want to run out of time here because the last one is what I'm getting the most questions about. It is part G, or first of all, the time and control. So these are not forever TFRs or forever UAFRs. They're 5-year in nature. So once they approve it, the entity will have 5 years of flight restrictions that they will enjoy. And then they have to resubmit it within 120 days of it expiring to get another 5 years. So that's going to be something they have to do all the time. There's requirements that the applicant's got to make sure they keep FAA up to date. There are some data retention things I think we need to figure out in the NPRM on what that means and things that you're going to have to report that you don't want to become too burdensome for the organization. But I think those are some other aspects of the term and conditions of an approved flight restriction. But the one that's causing a lot of the conversations right now is I think everyone expected this to be kind of like a normal 99.7 TFRs, where you don't fly over it without very explicit rules in place that allow someone who's gone through a thorough process, and mostly whitelisting your own drones. But instead, like I said, they created 2 types of UAFRs. There's a standard and the special. The standard allows basically anyone who has a credential. I'm a Part 107 pilot, and that I can actually fly over a UAFR so long as I give notice. And they're really murky on the details of what notice really means, and then what is the ability of the owner and operator of the facility's ability to say, I don't like that. Right? You don't really have that, I don't think, in the way it's built. So what you're having is going to be a pretty interesting process where the owners and operators are going to have a really mature airspace awareness, where they are constantly in tune to the waivers of those 4 different types of Part 91, Part 107, and Part 108. All those operators that will be allowed access over with what seeming to be is like a Lance process, where you just need to prove who you are, and you have to be able to say, I'm gonna fly directly over it in the shortest way possible. But you can do that. And so now that's a 24-hour job now, where you're constantly monitoring the airspace, looking for people who are going to be authorized to fly over, making the detection technology all the more important, so you can discriminate between who should be and who should not be there. So it is quite the operation for infrastructure to kind of position themselves for as now airspace managers, as well as terrestrial and cyber managers. That is kind of also has them scratching their head, like, how do we do this realistically? And why is so many people allowed to fly over a standard UFR into my facility? The special TFRs will be a little bit different, and I think they're going to follow the normal SGI process that 99.7s have, much more thorough. It requires a federal sponsor anyway, so they're going to have a say, and FAA is going to have a say, and they're probably going to be the ones who are like law enforcement, who need to fly over for a reason, or media who need to fly over for a reason, and they have a good justification. But the standard UFR, it allows for a lot of different opportunities to fly over, so long as a notification and whatever that means in the end for those infrastructure owners.
Wow. That's really interesting. Yeah.
It surprised a lot of people. It really did. It makes sense if you take the position that our end goal is not a nation built around counter UAS. If our end goal is about the integration, the safe and secure integration of UAS into the NAS, which I think is our goal, then it makes sense, right? But you have to be able to meet the people in the eye who are protecting those assets and help them understand that, or help make sense of that for them. That what's in our best interest, is this type of airspace management. It's just sad it can't be done under the auspice of UTM, right? So well before. The last thing, it talks about penalties. The last one, I'm done with it. The last one is the penalties, and it really is. It's kind of still hard to figure out what they're going to do. But civil penalties for people who violate, you get a slap on the hand, or you get your Part 107 license marked up, or worse if you do a special violation where there's possible criminal penalties. But I'm gonna stop here. See if there's any other questions or anything else you want to talk about, David.
Yeah, I mean, really, it is beautiful, like in the sense that it integrates everybody, into the picture, the compliant, the non-compliant, like the folks that want to do deliveries and all this. I almost wonder if that, you guys could tell me if that's partly why it's taken 10 years since 2209 was originally put out to say, go ahead, put flight restrictions. But then I would assume there was probably a lot of complexity in like, okay, let's just restrict out tens of thousands of like, vertical spaces over all these sites, and then just completely, Swiss cheese, as you guys have all said many times, Swiss cheese that low altitude where it basically just cripples, any sort of flights within that range. And so I think that may have been part of the delay, I think. And therefore this like gives a path forward. Like you still are allowed to secure your facility and perhaps, do something about it when you see someone that shouldn't be there. But now you have to have a whole system in place to prove that they shouldn't have been there. And so you have to know who should be there and you have to know who shouldn't, and you have to be able to show what your plan is for both. And then if you can prove it, hey, we've got all these systems up, we got a nuclear plant, whatever we have, and we saw 3 justified flights that had LANC approvals. We let those through. And then we saw this one, maybe it came up on radar, and it didn't come up on remote ID. And they're like, hey man, that group is not complying with the rules of the national airspace, so we took this action that we were approved to take, and then they could stand, that's liability protection for them, all the things, right? It's just definitely going to take all the village of all of us, everyone going to Expo, all these vendors, all these things. We've all been like parts and pieces of this, but this requires us all to work in concert. It's going to require, and all of the technologies, all of the, like knowledge that the consultants that you folks have. And there's going to be a couple standout organizations, right, that have probably already been, rolling out sensors, rolling out airspace management software, rolling out, that are going to be really well positioned day one to be like, well, we have that management. We have maybe part 108. We've got a whole, what do you call it? Kind of almost, I forget I want to say like an airline, they have to have their program, their aviation program. Once they have all these in place, man, they could go, all right, we're going to apply all that, but we have a critical site over here. We want to restrict that. But it's going to be a bit of a hill to climb, is what I'm sort of rambling to come to say. But I'll leave it there. I'll let you guys speak to it. I mean, Michelle, you came off mute. Do you want to toss in?
I think the one point that I want to make that strikes me about this, yes, it took a long time. I think it's very thoughtful. So I appreciate that they took their time. And what I'm seeing in this particular NPRM is that FAA change that I've been hoping for the last few years. What they've done with this SRMA process is they have brought the industry in to help them think through how they define risk and to take the industry's perspective into account. Imagine if we could do that with safety benefit. We have all kinds of sectors out there that are operating drones now, full on. And we have yet to calculate the safety benefits that those sectors measure that are outside of aviation and include those in our NAS performance analytics. I'd like to see that happen. I'd like to think that this NPRM is an indicator that our FAA is evolving now to recognizing that this back and forth with industry is how we get to something that is manageable by both and meaningful by both, so that it's a true representation of what the operation is doing and how it's affecting everyone. That's all.
Yeah. One parting thought I think is important to note is, and I really believe it's been an iteration. I think Max talked about that as well with where the new administration is kind of pressing the gas on counter UAS. We see what's over the horizon. We get an indication of what drones can do in theaters of conflict. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. It's not our reality today, but it could easily be a problem we face. And so the FAA and the Homeland Security entities, I think some of the delay was because we had to learn each other. We had to sniff each other out for a long time. And I was someone, I got it in bed with me for a while from the FAA just to help me understand what the FAA safety conversation looked like at CISA. And that was critical for me. And the same thing, I spent a lot of time with the FAA helping them understand what the concerns for critical infrastructure from a security perspective were. So we had to get through that scar tissue to get to have real conversations about risk and safety. But I think this sets the conditions for what we need long term. We need established flight restrictions, and we need to practice that for a while before we can have mitigation and detection at scale within critical infrastructure. So we have the Safer Skies Act with the SLTT. That's still not at scale. You have to have it at the facilities you care most about, and you do that through these iterative steps where you prove yourself worthy. I use quotes, worthy and capable of doing it well. And I think that seems to be the path we're on, and I'm excited about that. And I think this is one of those necessary steps.
Such a good conversation, man. I can't wait to hear you speak about it next week, live at Expo. We'll see all you guys there. I'm sure people have meetings here on the hour, so we'll wrap up. Thanks, Max. Thanks, Michelle, as well. Thank you so much, Scott. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you. Safe travel. See you there, guys.